On va voir au niveau d'outils spécifiques qui sont utilisés ou proposés par des pays, des juridictions, des organisations. Et on va aussi parler de l'établissement de la confiance entre les différents partenaires. Alors, dans un premier temps, on a une présentation de Catherine pour à peu près 30 minutes. Ensuite, on va se diviser en ateliers. Et pour faire ça le plus simple, on va reprendre les mêmes groupes qu'on a déjà fait pour plutôt cet après-midi. Alors, ça va aller plus vite. Nicole?
Avant de faire le brief, je vais juste faire une petite présentation, comme tu l'as fait.
D'accord. Donc, après la présentation de Catherine, Nicole va faire une courte présentation, Nicole Valentine, puis ensuite, on va se rediviser dans nos 5 groupes. Donc, en premier, c'est Catherine, ensuite, un petit mot de Nicole, on se divise en groupes et on va revenir ensuite. Merci, Catherine.
Bonjour, hello, and thank you very much. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today about Wales and the development of our sustainable development legislation. It's a great honour to be in Quebec to join you, and I hope that you'll find the presentation interesting in terms of your own country contexts. Wales, I don't know if you know, it's a small country in the UK. We have a population of 3 million, and we have devolved responsibilities for some policy issues, including health. And we also have a separate and thriving Welsh language, which unfortunately I can't speak, but my children can. So they have the opportunity to talk about me as much as they want. So it's not a strategy I recommend. I recommend you learn the language where you live. So I think we share a lot of similarities with Quebec, and I hope to be able to draw on some of these for you. So Wales faces many of the same opportunities and threats that we've been talking about today: globalisation, climate change, new technologies, coupled with changing demands on our services. We have an ageing and growing population, and these demographic and economic and social changes are really affecting life in Wales and shaping what we do and how we respond to those demands. And they require us to identify more sustainable ways of working, how we grow our economy, how we think about our transport solutions and our infrastructure. We also have some of the poorest regions in the UK. We've got poorer health outcomes reflected across all social gradients and evident through a range of indicators that we collect. We see real differences in terms of life expectancy for both men and women. We've been discussing already today that those differences are linked to very complex determinants. Those are not unique to Wales, but I think they have a fairly a Welsh dimension. And whilst, as I said, we don't have all of the policy levers at our disposal, so in terms of some of those macroeconomic policy levers, some of the welfare levers, we can act where on some of the devolved areas, and we're doing that as much as possible. So I think the Sustainable Development Goals gave Wales a really good opportunity. The indivisible and the universal nature of the goals really forced us to think about how we integrate our policies and our action across those different domains, social, economic and environmental. And the Sustainable Development Goals certainly challenged us to think about our approach, adopting very much a whole of government, whole of society approach that left no one behind. And with this ambition, we've decided to develop Welsh legislation to make sustainable development the central organising principle of the Welsh Public Service. Because we set out to develop legislation that would help us tackle the interrelated nature of some of the health problems that we were facing, health inequalities and obesity. They require a real spectrum of response with collective action at both a national and regional and local level. We also wanted to mobilise society, and that's been a really key part of our legislation, as a catalyst for behavioural change, and that's large-scale behavioural change, and also to think long-term. Essentially, if we're to serve and sustain future generations. So our legislation commits the whole of public service, so that includes Welsh Government, to taking collective action to meet and deliver against 7 wellbeing goals. And these are designed to maximise our contribution to the wellbeing of our country. Each goal is defined within the legislation, and each goal has equal importance. So you can see there that we've got goals for health and equity, and they're on par with other societal goals. But perhaps what makes a real difference to this legislation, and as I've been working in Welsh Government for many years, developing several policies and also developing several bits of national strategic legislation, such as the Public Health Act. But nowhere in the legislation that I've been developing has had a requirement to work in a particular way. So this legislation is different in that not only it tells us what we should be doing, but it also tells us how we should be doing it. So these sustainable development principles, we call them, or the ways of working, include working in an integrated way. So that really helps us define how we think about health, not just achieved through access to good quality healthcare, but based on socioeconomic status, based on an enabling physical environment, and the provision of evidence-based interventions throughout the life course. The Sustainable Development Principles also require us to think preventatively and working collaboratively. And there is an involvement principle. We need to involve the diverse communities that we are planning and deciding and making our services for those communities. So we need to involve them in the decisions that we take. I thought it would be helpful to look back at the evaluations of our policy approaches before 2015 to think about what led us to develop the legislation. I mentioned the Sustainable Development Goals, but I think it's important to realise that Wales had a commitment to sustainable development since 1998, when we first got devolved responsibilities. So between 1998 and 2011, we continued to assess and evaluate our many strategies for sustainable development, but we realised that we weren't having the kind of impact that we desired. We were working in silos, not taking into account the needs of whole populations, not engaging the diverse public service, including the range of voluntary services at our disposal, and we were really failing to target the needs and build on the assets of our post-industrial communities. Involving people in the many decisions that affect them, their families and their communities, where and how they live, their access to local services and their job opportunities is now a requirement of the legislation. But this involvement principle was very much part of how we developed the legislation. Certainly in some of our discussions on our table, we talked about how are we engaging with communities, how are we doing that? Well, we had a very strong example of this through our national conversation. This was held over 2 years, where we engaged with the Welsh public and we asked them to tell us what mattered to them, their families and their future generations. This really helped us to reframe what we meant by sustainable development. So when we first started talking to the public, we were often using the term sustainable development. In fact, we had at one point a white paper, which is a series of policy proposals on sustainable development. But through that national conversation, we changed the whole title of our legislation. It's now called the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, because this was very much in keeping with what people were telling us. And it moved us really away from that purely, or perceived to be a purely environmental agenda. What mattered to the people that we were talking to also helped inform the content of the 7 wellbeing goals, so that it helped influence and inform the decision makers at that time. Another important factor to realise in terms of the difference of our legislation is understanding that this engagement and appreciation of our communities also led to a change of our working definition of sustainable development per se. So we added cultural, and this is a really important dimension, and certainly in terms of the work that we've been looking at in terms of other legal frameworks around the world, it's this cultural dimension to the legislation that sort of grounds it and connects it with the context of where you're operating. Again, I think this is something that you're doing in Quebec, and it's something that you're aspiring to do, but it's very much seen as important to us and embrace the kind of historical aspect of our language and our culture. So I won't go through this now, but the legislation has put in place a fairly complex architecture. We have new structures, we have new accounting mechanisms, we have indicators, 46 national indicators that we need to report against and monitor. And it's really this architecture that's driving and helping to facilitate change. And perhaps in the workshop, if there are any questions about the architecture in terms of how it engages the kind of main statutory partners, how there are a number of mechanisms that involve, for example, the Auditor General, who has a requirement to monitor the whole of public service. The Auditor General in Wales now has a requirement to monitor how the public service is responding to the legislation. But we can discuss that in the workshop. One of the discussions we had around in our workshop just now was around communication. And I thought it would be helpful just to show you the communication product, the video that was produced when the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act was coming into force. And this was used as a sort of public information campaign for the public, for stakeholders, about what we were trying to do and what we were aspiring to do. So I don't know if you're able to play the video.
Welcome to Wales, Megan. Welcome to the world. A new life is a time to be optimistic. But what does Megan need to justify our optimism? The NHS has already helped her healthy birth, and health services will continue to support her for the rest of her life. As she grows up, she will need a good education, starting at home, then at school, then maybe university or taking up an apprenticeship. Megan will also need a good job where she's happy and prosperous. If Megan is to succeed, whatever her background or circumstances, she'll need to live in a more equal Wales. She'll need to live in a community that has everything she needs to thrive and prosper. For Megan to be happy in her community, it will need to be attractive, safe and supportive. She may enjoy visiting museums, watching a film, a local show, dancing or other art. As a Welsh speaker, she'll want to do so bilingually. She'll be proud of her heritage. Whether it's simply getting to school, work or the shops, she'll need to be physically active throughout her life to keep well. And she'll need to live in a community that promotes good health. Megan will also need fresh water, clean air and healthy food. This means maintaining our beautiful environment and using our natural resources in a sustainable way. Growing up, Megan learned more about the planet and the importance of being a responsible global citizen. So, over her life, Megan has many needs. The good news is that these needs can be met. However, there are a few challenges in the way, such as poverty, an increasingly global economy, an ageing population, poor health, and the inequality of health between people, climate change, and pressures on our natural resources, and rising demand for quality public services. We know that we cannot face these challenges by doing things the way we always have. We need to take a different path. We have to live and work differently. That's why we have a new law in Wales, the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. It's unique in the world. As someone from the United Nations has said, what Wales is doing today, the world will do tomorrow. It's based on the knowledge that the environment in which we live, the economy that gives us jobs, the society in which we mix, and the cultures that we share are all connected. To Megan too. This is why the law requires 44 public bodies covering the whole of Wales to work towards 7 interconnected goals. 4. A prosperous Wales. A resilient Wales, a healthier Wales, a more equal Wales, a Wales of cohesive communities, a Wales of vibrant culture and thriving Welsh language, a globally responsible Wales. This gives us all a common purpose, but we'll need to work differently. This includes public bodies working together in public service boards to prepare a single shared plan for action. There are 5 ways in which we need to work differently. Decisions made today must have a positive and long-term impact for the future. We need to understand the effect a decision may have on the goals and on other public bodies in an integrated way. We must involve the people we serve in all their diversity. We must collaborate to find common solutions. And we must actively prevent problems appearing or getting worse. Prevention is better than cure. The law requires us to do all of these things. This is a big change. But it's not just for public bodies. Businesses, the third sector, you and your community can also play an important part. The law has set up a Future Generations Commissioner to encourage, advise and promote this change. The Commissioner will act as a guardian for our future, for Megan's future, and for people of all ages. This is the Wales that Megan wants. It's the Wales we all want. To find out more about the Act, you can visit the Wales We Want and Welsh Government websites.
Thank you. So I can see that we're a bit pushed for time. So I've got a few more slides, but I will just touch upon this one. And we'll circulate the slides afterwards. But I thought it would be helpful to put down some of the enablers I think were really useful to us in terms of introducing this legislation. And again, if anyone wants to ask me about those, they can. These also, looking at what we know about successful health in all policies governance, if we map across, very much chime with the kind of enablers that I've mentioned. I think it's quite helpful to see, so we mentioned the Future Generations Commissioner. The Future Generations Commissioner is an independent commissioner. As far as I know, it's a unique role. We can't find anything quite like it in the world, but she has a remit to kind of monitor, to advocate and to challenge public bodies about how they're responding. We have year one report that she did. Again, we can circulate the links, and next year she'll be reporting on the 5 years of the Act since it came into force. So next year we'll get a real picture of the impact of the Act is having. But she's been telling us already about the benefits of the legislation and the impact on public services and the difference that it's making. But one thing, I think she's constantly saying that we need to kind of do this at pace and at scale. So she needs to see more results and more impact on a day-to-day level. She talked about influencing some practical behavioural change, particularly about the sustainable development ways of working, but not enough. And the same goes from the Auditor General. Again, Year 1 reports talks about some of the positives in terms of how the Act is having an impact, but increasingly there's a real view that we need more tools and more methods to help embed some of those ways of working. It's not easy, it's quite challenging to turn those from fairly aspirational ways of practice to everyday responsibility. And then just potentially another view on progress. Wales is part of the Joint Action for Health Equity Europe, and this involves 25 countries participating in developing a number of policy frameworks with a menu of actions. So they're policy frameworks that are helping the 25 countries involved develop better policies, improve the monitoring, the governance, implementation and evaluation. And Wales is participating in Work Package 9, which is governance for all health and all policies. But Wales is there as the competent authority in the UK, so there's an understanding that due to our previous work in joint action and our legacy of work tackling health inequalities in particular, that we've been asked to kind of, as I say, represent the UK in this particular joint action. It's led by Finland, so Timo and Heli and her team were involved in this, and I was with them in Rome last week. And we talked about Finland have sort of pulled together this work package, governance for health and all policies, the policy framework. Again, it's something that we've talked about several times today already. But this is the kind of policy framework that's being shared with the 25 countries who now need to kind of implement that policy framework over the next year, 3 years, and report back. Again, very much links to the kind of good practice that we know about the lessons for governance and health and all policies, but I'll skip that now. And what I wanted to put up there was that the report that we had last week, they've been trying to kind of map countries in the various ways. So they've been assessed against whether they have a legal framework, whether they have a political commitment, equity-orientated health systems, and so on. So I've actually taken the liberty of putting this slide together as just a sort of summary of where some of the countries are at. Very pleased that Wales is with Finland and Norway, but I have to say some of the data is based on self-reported comparisons, so some of the data might not be there from all of the countries. But it really felt, from a views on the progress, it really felt that Wales were certainly aligned with some of the approaches, as I say, in our Scandinavian counterparts. But it was a really interesting piece of work, the mapping, and I think perhaps some of the information from the various work packages we could share through the global network. And lastly, just because of time, so I've skipped over many of those slides because of the time restraints, but thinking about some of those findings from the Office of Future Generations Commissioner and the Auditor General, as an official working on the development of that legislation and now working in a small health and sustainability hub which has been set up to support the implementation of the legislation, I was very interested to hear what the feedback was in terms of the impact. It feels that this is a golden opportunity in Wales. We have this governance structure in place, and if we don't make the most of what could potentially be a radical, transformative agenda, we'll have missed the boat. And the key thing is about how we actually move from taking those sustainable development principles to putting that into practice. You know, how do we really work collaboratively? How do we work in an integrated way? How do we think long term? So I commissioned a literature review, and we published the findings of that a couple of weeks ago, and the workshop that I'll be doing later will sort of tell you a bit more about the literature review. But essentially there are 5 recommendations coming out of that, which really give us some ideas about how we make sustainable development a kind of everyday reality. And that literature review has informed and influenced a number of tools and products that we're producing in the Health and Sustainability Hub. And the Hub is there to not only support the organisation that we're in, but to support the wider NHS and also the whole of public service in Wales. But ideally, we would like these findings and some of these tools and products to be useful to you. So this is a bit of a plug to come to the workshop at the next workshop to find out about some of the tools we're developing, but just to say, also take a look at the findings in the literature review, which will circulate. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you, Catherine. So we're going to go with the workshop. Nicole, do you want to come? It's just that we're running out of time. Maybe during the workshop we can ask more questions.
Sounds
good. Hi. I'm presenting on behalf of a colleague of mine, Carmel Williams, who works with at the Government of South Australia. And together, Carmel in particular was very interested in this topic of trust. Her and her team have, next slide please, or do I press something, don't I? So I'm going to do a very quick presentation to explore a paper that they've written on the topic of trust and why it's important in the context of intersectoral relationships and intersectoral governance. And then in our group work, we'll discuss that together. And I'd ask you to go back to those same groups that you were for Timo's section. And then we'll have just a 5-minute wrap-up at the end to prepare for the plenary tomorrow, because we'll actually have the report back tomorrow, both from this workshop and from the workshop with Catherine that will follow mine. So straight after this, we're going to the second workshop. Moving on, the paper that was written by Carmel and some colleagues is shown here, The Role of Trust in Joined-Up Government Activities, Experiences from Health in All Policies in South Australia. And the reason why Carmel was interested in this topic is that she believes it's fundamental to the work that we do on health in all policies. And she's interested in asking the global network and its members, can we put together a more detailed understanding of how you build and maintain trust in work in order to make health and all policies more effective? So in their paper, they explore what are the concepts of trust, and they describe these ideas related to the concept that trust is relational. It's about individuals or groups forming bonds and assessing vulnerability to risk and betrayal in the formation of those bonds. So they form the relationships and then assess how much they invest in them on basis of the risks involved. At the same time, the bonds that people have would mediate risks, because if you already have invested time in the relationship, it can then help to reduce the risks of outside change. Trust in all the literature is conditional. It's attached, therefore, to expectations of behavior, and therefore trust can be lost, obviously. And trust is important for making judgments that inspire action and belief. So in order for another sector to work with you, there has to be some trust to inspire an action to do something that's a bit out of the ordinary, as we work in siloed structures, which have their reason and their rationale and their efficacy as well. How does trust work was examined in this paper as well. There were 3 ways of looking at trust in terms of 3 types of typologies. The one, organizational typology, talked about different types of mechanisms that are used to develop trust. So it's a process of exchange, or it's based on looking at the characteristics, or it's based on some analysis of the institution and the supports the institution provides for trust. Another way of looking at trust was by the level. Is it trust between individuals? Is it trust within a group? Or is it trust within the whole system? And another way of looking at trust was to look at quality and strength. Is trust high or low? So these are different ways that the literature evaluates trust. And from a sociological perspective, the authors of this paper explore from Gideon's the concept of trust being something fluid. They make the observation from Gideon's that traditional societies with lots of rules have more trust embedded in them because people believe the rules there. And I think it's very important in the context of globalization, because with globalization there are fewer rules. This then disembeds trust. So there's some advantages and disadvantages. So what we have is to re-embedding trust requires some faith in an abstract expert system. For example, I would say the Wellbeing Act of Wales is a new way of dealing with recreating systems for trust, dealing with globalization, sustainability, and more ready for our times. So another observation is that trust develops once contact points become known, and then the points, there are some indicators of competence. So the reports from the auditor in Wales, the reports from the commissioner in Wales are going to be important signals for people to have trust in a new system and in a new way of working for integration and with collaboration. And then Giddens talks about the ebbs of trust and mistrust, and that is not a binary. You can have flows of mistrust and trust sort of happening simultaneously in a way. So that's just a bit of background on the literature they covered, and why they say it applies to intersectoral governance in particular is because of the breakdown of the rules. We don't have a stable situation for very fixed rules. Perhaps the Public Health Act again in Wales is starting to look to provide that. But if the cross-sectional relationships are not well established, like they are for silos or for traditional vertical ways of working, trust is going to naturally play a greater role. And so we need to understand more about the practices that bring about trust. So what Carmel and the researchers there did was to survey some of the public servants through an online survey in South Australia. And there's a picture of South Australia. So it was done in 2013 and 2015. The questionnaire information is there, and the final number of respondents is there, who was eligible and who finally responded. Eventually 128 from 14 departments in 2013, and 92 from 13 departments in 2015. The study questions were these posed, and these are the questions for your group work to think about in your group work as well. How is trust created in joined-up government relationships? How is trust maintained? And how can trust be lost, and what happens when trust is lost, or what can you do to change that? So in their study, they found that technical competency of individuals, trust in the process itself, and institutions running the process, and that were important, and that the trust individuals sometimes compensated for problems in the system. So there's this balance between the system and the individuals. For maintaining trust, it was important to have an understanding of the other sector's perspectives and understand, what are the changes